Fellas, let me tell you something, okay? A word of advice in life. It's not always about how much you have, it's about how well you use what you do have. Now, that advice may not pertain exactly to fantasy football, but it goes hand in hand with exactly what we are talking about today: volume versus efficiency. What's going on, Headliner Nation? Today we continue my series on volume versus efficiency, and I've already done the volume monster videos for running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. Those 3 episodes are already done. And just like every single year, I'll do all the volume monsters episodes, and now we're gonna talk about insane efficiency. What running backs were the most efficient last season within the top 30 of carries? Now, these are the same running backs that were in the Volume Monsters episode. The top 30 in carries last season. We're going to talk about how well they did in terms of efficiency this year, and then we're going to see the discrepancy between where they ranked in volume and where they ranked in efficiency. But before I start diving into this huge video that you are not going to want to miss, I got to remind everybody that our 2025 Fantasy Football Draft Guide is already live. There are so many rookie scouting reports that you're going to want to start diving into right now. A rookie scouting report for every quarterback, wide receiver, tight end, and running back that were drafted in 2025. Dynasty rankings, and a ton of redraft information that is going to start pouring in over the next few weeks, making you ready for your draft when the end of summer gets here and fantasy football ramps up. Make sure you head to the link down in our description below, tfhdraftguide.com. Get your draft guide right now. The best bang for your buck fantasy football draft guide in the industry today. You will not pay less money for more information anywhere else. First category up in this video: yards per attempt. Now, yards per attempt within itself is not a category that you should be using to just make decisions. But a lot of these categories that we're talking about tonight, when you add them together and start seeing them combined, it paints a bigger picture in terms of how efficient a running back can be. Now, last year, inside the top 30 running backs in terms of carries, 5 running backs finished with lower than 4 yards per carry. Najee Harris, which is not shocking, Ramondre Stevenson, DeAndre Swift, Kenneth Walker, who might be the most shocking there, and Kareem Hunt. Now, really, that standard for a long time has been like 4 yards per carry, but really we're sitting inside a time frame where if you're realistically not around 4.4 or 4.5, you're considered a highly inefficient running back. So are there any guys here with a low yards per carry that will still overall score pretty high? Is there anybody here that has a high yards per carry but will in the end score pretty low when all the categories are added up? At the very top, Derrick Henry averaging almost 6 yards per carry. And some of you out there think that Derrick Henry doesn't have enough juice for 2025. You go ahead and make that mistake, because the rest of you that are here listening to the headliners, we're not going to lead you astray. Derrick Henry could be in for another big year. Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs. How about Bucky Irving finishing at number 4? Jordan Mason finished at number 5. I guarantee we're going to be talking about these guys more in depth towards the end of this video. All of these guys averaged over 5 yards per carry, and a guy like Jordan Mason and Bucky Irving didn't have a ton of volume last season, but the volume they did have was highly efficient. We're going to dive into whether or not that is sustainable moving forward. Yards after contact per attempt. One of my 2 favorite statistics to look at every single season for running backs. This is a great indicator on what type of yardage are running backs picking up regardless of where they're being hit. So if you take a look at yards per attempt, sometimes that can really skew numbers one way or another for running backs that don't really have a great offensive line and are getting hit behind the line of scrimmage, aka Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker was very low in yards per attempt. A guy that unfortunately gets hit behind the line of scrimmage, and even though he makes up for it in different areas, he just isn't able to get a ton of yards per carry. But yards after contact per attempt measures from the first time you get hit, not overall yards past the line of scrimmage. So for yards after contact per attempt, Bucky Irving was the only running back last year to average over 4 yards after contact per attempt, and it wasn't even close. Tank Bigsby was behind him at 3.74. Now, Bucky Irving is widely considered a top fantasy option this year and is inside the top 10 rankings for almost any website that you were to look at. And I agree he could be in for a very big year, but I'm wondering if this video could set the hype out of control. Now, one guy that I've made fun of for a couple of years now is Tank Bigsby. And I didn't really make fun of Tank Bigsby because he truly is a bad NFL running back. It was more along the lines of people who overhyped Tank Bigsby a couple of years ago when he was a rookie, when Travis Etienne was playing so well. Now, Travis Etienne, when he deals with injuries and such, Tank Bigsby took over last season, and he played well last year, and he definitely deserves to be in at least a 50-50 split backfield. But Liam Cohen is talking about Travis Etienne like he's adopting him as another son. He loves Travis Etienne. The new coaching staff there apparently really likes him. So what are we going to be getting from a backfield with Tank Bigsby, Travis Etienne, other draft picks that have been made? Bichelle Tutton out of Virginia Tech is going to be a guy that could end up being a very good running back. So Tank Bigsby, at the end of this video, when we talk about his overall efficiency, we really have to wonder if this is going to be enough to give him the most carries in the backfield for Jacksonville this year. There's going to be some familiar names that you already know are going to be at the top of this list a majority of the time. Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, a couple of those names that you know are probably going to be featured quite a bit throughout this video, and we'll talk about more at the end of the video. Now, guys like Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard is a guy that isn't going to rank very highly across the board here, but he's going to have some high scores and he's going to have some low scores. And at the end of the video, it's going to be interesting to see if one area outweighs another. Same goes for a guy like Tony Pollard, where when you look at his efficiency, he's going to have some scores that are high, he's going to have some scores that are low. But in the end, is it enough to see him as a guy with a lot of upside potential, or maybe a guy that, yes, he's going to be efficient in some areas, but not really efficient in others, so he's still going to be a good floor play? Coming into this video, I love Tony Pollard's value with where his ADP seems to be heading, but we'll have to see if I change my mind after going through some of these things. Jordan Mason finishing inside the top 10 once again. Jahmyr Gibbs. James Conner is a name that's going to consistently pop up here. We're going to have a big decision to make with him this year as well. A guy like Rico Dowdle as well. Rico Dowdle is a guy that is not getting another shot in Dallas. They decided to move on from him, and Rico Dowdle finds himself on a one-year deal where? Carolina with Chuba Hubbard. That's going to be a tough backfield to work his way through as well. We'll see how all of this ends up working out, but there's a couple of names inside the top 10 that we have to wonder if it's going to hold up throughout the rest of this video. What about guys at the end of the list here? A guy like Kyren Williams and Jonathan Taylor. Those are a couple of names that we need to see way higher, especially with where they are going to be drafted this fantasy season. A guy like Tyrone Tracy, who at times was pretty good last season. We need to see some better efficiency from him, especially if a guy like Cam Scatabo is going to come in and start taking touches away. Ramondre Stevenson, he's going to have competition in the backfield this year. A guy like Najee Harris, he was the guy in Los Angeles after free agency, but then they drafted Omari and Hampton to pair with him. Najee Harris over the last few years has not really been that efficient of a running back. It's been all about the volume with Najee Harris. Now there has been, a couple of comments left in videos when I've talked about Najee Harris where people have said, but he's got bad quarterbacks. Offensive scheme was poor. Arthur Smith hurt things like that. And I get it and I understand it. But this is an area where I would expect Najee Harris to be a little bit better. Yards after contact per attempt, because even if his offensive line isn't that great, even if you're facing 8 men in the box, we need a few extra yards regardless of where you're getting hit. But let's talk about Najee Harris into another category. He finished 7th in avoided tackles per attempt at 0.24. So it seems like he was making people miss, but maybe he had so many people collapsing on him that after he did get hit, he wasn't picking up a ton of yards. Maybe it means he's a very lateral runner. There are running backs who will make people miss, but they go east and west so much instead of north and south that, yes, they make some guys miss, but they're not picking up yards in the process. And with LA this year, he definitely should have a better job in terms of efficiency because of the offense that he is in and the weapons around him, but his volume could be a whole lot less this year. Other guys in this area, someone who always scores well in avoided tackles per attempt, Kenneth Walker III. This is an area that he dominates year after year. Yeah, so 29th in yards per attempt for Kenneth Walker. Not great, right? But then we talked about the difference, like if you have a poor offensive line, what that can do to you, why maybe looking at yards after contact per attempt is a little bit better. So in yards after contact per attempt, he jumps to 16th. So he's more like middle of the pack. But then in avoided tackles per attempt, he jumps all the way to first at 0.40. The next closest person to him is 0.29. That's a pretty big differential there for Kenneth Walker. So even though he's been banged up and injuries have really been the problem with Kenneth Walker, with this new offensive scheme, you really got to wonder if he stays healthy this year, if this is going to be the breakout campaign for him, because his efficiency year after year is still pretty darn good in several categories. James Conner is that guy at number 2 that we were talking about, widely overlooked heading into draft season. Should you be overlooking at him? Bucky Irving and Tank Bigsby scoring well in another category together. Derrick Henry and Jahmyr Gibbs, names we're going to see at the top of the list all the way through. Jordan Mason tied for 7th with a guy like Bijan Robinson right behind him at 0.23. Josh Jacobs at 0.22. David Montgomery at 0.21. Those are some pretty darn good running backs. For Jordan Mason to be higher than an avoided tackles per attempt, Jordan Mason to me is a guy that we need to pay way more attention to. This year for efficiency, I've added a couple of categories that I really felt like that we should be paying a little bit more attention to. And when we're talking about efficiency, one thing that we've kind of neglected in this video over the last few years has been big plays. So let's add big run percentage. Big runs being defined of runs are 15 or more yards. So the percentage you see on screen is the percentage of yards for that running back for the entire season that were accumulated on runs of 15 or more yards. Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, and Jahmyr Gibbs at the top of this list are not shocking whatsoever. Jordan Mason again. And when I start pulling all the information for my dynamic running back rating, I am really excited to see where Jordan Mason lands, because I'll tell you what, right now, Jordan Mason may be one of my favorite breakout candidates for this coming season. Aaron Jones truthers, I'm sorry. Jordan Mason may have that job before too long once the season starts. Jonathan Taylor finishing pretty high here, which is good to see. He finished 9th in yards per attempt, but then 28th in yards after contact per attempt, 29th in avoided tackles per attempt. You got to wonder if the quarterback situation had something to do with that, but good to still see some big runs. Unfortunately, the name of the game with Jonathan Taylor last year was more about the big runs than anything. Bucky Irving scoring high once again. J.K. Dobbins, a free agent right now. Does he end up landing with a team? He ended up finishing 7th last year. Good to see, especially after so many injuries. When you lose explosiveness and that big playability, good for J.K. Dobbins. Tank Bigsby, he comes in at number 8. Tank Bigsby, he's going to be a guy that we're going to talk about at the end of this video a lot more. Devon Achane, a guy that's being drafted as a top top 5 running back in some leagues, top 10 in almost every league. You got to wonder if the volume increases for him this year. If it does he stay healthy, and does it hurt the efficiency? Tyrone Tracy, I mean, we talked about him, and we talked about how low he was in yards after contact per attempt and avoided tackles per attempt, but big playability was definitely there. James Conner, James Cook. Now, at the very bottom of the list, a guy like David Montgomery might come as a little bit of shock to you, but realistically, when you look at what David Montgomery does, I mean, he is a guy that, no, he's not having a bunch of carries for 15 or more yards. And some of that is because of how many carries he gets in the red zone, which is something we're going to talk about very soon. So we'll keep that right there. But goal line carries, red zone carries, he scores a lot of touchdowns. So those are plays where he's not scoring 15 or more yards, right? Because there's not more than 15 yards in front of him. Even when it comes to those plays in between the 20, he's a guy that is pounding the rock, picking up 7, 8, 9, 10 yards, something like that, even if 15 yards is not something that is consistent in that area. All right, let's go ahead and dive into some receiving statistics here for just a couple of minutes before we end this thing with a few more efficiency stats when it comes to just overall play at the running back position. Yards per target. When you see guys up here like a David Montgomery, not a ton of work in the passing game, but when he gets work, you know, he's very solid because a lot of people don't really expect him to be getting any work, and when he does, it's slipping out of the backfield, kind of a last resort dump off, and because they have so many weapons, typically those yards per target is picking up quite a bit of yards. Derrick Henry is another one that kind of falls into that. Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley, you know, these are all guys, Brian Robinson, that their yards per target are a little bit on the higher side, but they're guys that might not be utilized a whole lot in the passing game, so when they do get looks, you know, it's kind of a surprise to opposing defenses, and they're able to pick up a few yards here and there. Now, Saquon Barkley obviously was an elite pass catcher at one point in time. Doesn't really do that anymore, especially in Philadelphia. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Still a tremendous year last year, even without a ton of work in the passing game. And even if he regresses a little bit this season and doesn't run for nearly as many yards, he's not going to need to replace it with a bunch of work in the passing game for us to automatically be like, oh, Saquon Barkley isn't going to have the same upside he did last year if we don't get this. But guys like Jahmyr Gibbs, I mean, Jahmyr Gibbs gets a ton of volume in the passing game, still very, very good. So his efficiency doesn't seem to be hurt. Bucky Irving is a name that's great to see up here because we're looking at Bucky Irving as being a complete running back in terms of on the ground and through the air. And maybe he's not going to get a ton of work in the passing game because they have 97 options at wide receiver this year. But when he does get some looks, like in 4 wide receiver sets, when linebackers and cornerbacks and safeties and everybody's trying to keep up with these guys out of the backfield, or these guys at wide receiver, when all of these players are drugged downfield and then Bucky Irving just slips out of the backfield, he's going to have some big plays out there. James Conner continues to show up high on this list over and over and over. He's a very, very efficient running back last year. Can he hold off Trey Benson and keep that job? You got to wonder a guy like DeAndre Swift with a ton of receiving options there as well, just like I mentioned with Bucky Irving. Is he going to get a little bit more volume this year in the passing game, or is he going to be a guy that's going to have to rely on maybe a few looks here or there? DeAndre Swift, I'm not in love with him. Not a big fan of DeAndre Swift. I really feel like they would have replaced him if it would have been right, but really, Ben Johnson clearly wasn't a big fan of DeAndre Swift already once in his career, so I really just don't see him being a big fan of DeAndre Swift moving forward. All right, let's take a look at yards per reception now. So kind of like we talked about with like the wide receivers, how many targets did they get? How many receptions did they have? How many receiving yards did they have? What did it look like when we took a look at yards per target compared to yards per reception? And really, yards per target stayed pretty close across the board. Henry at 1, second in targets. Jahmyr Gibbs at 2, fourth in targets. Josh Jacobs third and third. David Montgomery was fourth in yards per reception, first in yards per target. DeAndre Swift, 5th in yards per reception, 7th in yards per target. A guy like James Conner, 6 and 6. So when you take a look at the top 6 guys here, all of these guys were top 7 in terms of yards per target. So the targets they were getting were also turning into yards as well. But what about the guys like Joe Mixon and Breece Hall? Both of these guys finished tied for 15th in yards per target, but are 7th and 8th in yards per reception. So Mixon and Hall were doing a little bit more with a little bit less because their yards per target were a little bit lower. Then you got a guy like Saquon Barkley, 8 and 9. Really the biggest faller here that we saw was Aaron Jones. He went from 9th in yards per target down to 13th in yards per reception. Outside of that, not a ton of huge fallers. Really, it was very, very close to being even across the board. The guys that were pretty high in yards per target were also pretty high in yards per reception. Yards after the catch per reception, really the brother to yards after contact per attempt, just on the passing side of things. Another statistic that I love to look at. A guy like Joe Mixon, 15th in yards per target, 7th in yards per reception, 6th in yards after the catch per reception. A guy that was getting some swing passes out of the backfield was picking up a lot of yards after he made the catch. Kareem Hunt was another guy that jumped dramatically. 13th in yards per target, 18th in yards per reception, 9th in yards after the catch per reception. Tank Bigsby, another big gain here. 24th in yards per target, 17th in yards per reception, but 10th in yards after the catch per reception. Does Tank Bigsby deserve a little bit more respect this season? I would like to say yes, but that backfield could end up being a mess. The biggest faller here is Saquon Barkley, 8th in yards per target, 9th in yards per reception, but 22nd in yards after the catch per reception. Now, one thing that could offset some of these numbers here, where exactly did those targets take place? Because a guy like Joe Mixon, maybe a lot of those targets took place behind the line of scrimmage. So after he's catching the ball behind the line of scrimmage, he's gaining more yards. Whereas a guy like Saquon Barkley, maybe he is getting a certain amount of yards per target per reception, but a lot of those are past the line of scrimmage. And when he's catching the ball, he's basically going down shortly after, instead of getting more of a running start and then being able to swing to the outside and picking up a few yards on the ground. So there are some different things that could be in play there, but it is interesting to know a guy like Tank Bigsby is very good after the catch. And that is going to be something that could help separate him from Tuttle and ETN, because if ETN is seen as that type of a back, you really got to wonder if you see this on tape with Tank Bigsby, if Travis Etienne, if they're really as high on him as what they're saying right now. One thing that I want to touch on that also I have not used in previous videos is red zone rushing attempt percentage. So this is the amount of their rushing attempts throughout the season that took place in the red zone. And I mentioned David Montgomery earlier, and guess what? He's number one. 26.5% of his rushes come in the red zone. A guy like Joe Mixon, James Cook, who scored a ton of touchdowns last year, Brian Robinson, who really should be a sneaky RB3 type of look this season. I mean, when you get a guy that is a little bit better efficiency-wise than what you expect him to be, with an improved offense there with Deebo Samuel, second-year Jaden Daniels, Brian Robinson, if he keeps this same type of efficiency, could end up being a very solid play every week. Even if it's not spectacular, every single week, he could be a guy that you could be looking at flex numbers from. It's good to see Kyren Williams up here, because Kyren Williams across the board, you'll see at the end of the video, has not been good with his efficiency this year. But there is one thing that we know for certain when it comes to Kyren Williams: he has touchdown potential. So even if the efficiency wasn't that great last year, we know he's going to have an opportunity to score touchdowns. Jordan Mason finishing all the way up here, tied for 5th. Again, Jordan Mason's name continues to come up. Some numbers that we need to see go higher. Breece Hall is a definite concern. Breece Hall is a concern. Maybe they go to Braylon Allen a little bit more often. But for a guy that wasn't that efficient last year and wasn't getting a ton of looks in the red zone, that's not good. Now, last year may have been because the offense was so bad. So that's why they weren't getting a ton of red zone attempts. If the offense is better this season, will that number tick back up for him? A guy like Tony Pollard would like to see this number higher. Kenneth Walker would like to see this number higher. Alvin Kamara would like to see this number higher. Derrick Henry is lower here, but one thing you want to keep in mind with Derrick Henry is the fact that he didn't have to get a ton of red zone carries because typically he was converting when he did. And just the sheer amount of carries that he had last season was a lot higher than some of these other guys. So if they were getting a few more red zone carries, but less overall carries, then that number is going to look a little skewed, making Derrick Henry look like he's not getting the ball nearly enough in the red zone when he actually is. Fantasy points per snap. We're also going to be talking about fantasy points per touch in just a minute, and how these two may have been a little bit different. Essentially, for all the fantasy points you scored last year, how many fantasy points did you average for every snap that you were playing on the field? Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery being at the very top of this list, absolutely no shock whatsoever. These two guys, from an efficiency standpoint, two of the best running backs in all the NFL. James Cook, Derrick Henry, Bucky Irving, Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley. Joe Mixon, probably a little bit surprising. He was very good to begin the year, but in the back half of the year, things were not good. They've kind of revamped that offensive line. Is it going to be as bad as last season? Devon Achane, James Conner all the way up here. Alvin Kamara. Good to see Alvin Kamara all the way up here. A name that hasn't really come up all that much that we're going to talk about in a minute is Bijan Robinson. Some guys at the very end of the list here, though. You see a guy like Jordan Mason, who I've talked about quite a bit. Does this change what we're thinking at all? Why or why not? Kyren Williams, for a guy that's being really looked at as a top 12 running back, not going to look great in this video. But how do things look in points per touch? Let's go ahead and sort that, take a look at that column, and see how things were looking across the board. Jahmyr Gibbs, 1-1 right here. James Cook, 3 up to 1. Devon Achane is the first kind of big riser right here. He was 8th in points per snap last year, but 3rd in points per touch. So playing a lot of snaps, but when he was touching the ball, he was doing a lot with it. David Montgomery doesn't take that big of a fall. Neither does Derrick Henry or Bucky Irving or Saquon Barkley. Another big riser here is Kenneth Walker, playing a lot of snaps, but doing a lot with the ball when he did touch it. Same thing for Breece Hall. If you're looking for some encouragement this year, this would be right here. Overall volume, not great. But when he was touching the ball, that was a good thing. He was scoring points when he was touching the football. Maybe we just need to get him actually touching the football a little bit more often. A couple of guys that were big fallers here. You take the first at the look one. Take a look at the first one. You got Joe Mixon. He drops from 8th to 15th. Josh Jacobs. He also drops from 6th to 13th as well. And then at the very bottom of the list here, you got a guy like Najee Harris. Plays a lot of snaps. He drops from 16th all the way down to 29th. But how about we stop now and take a look at overall score. All right, let's focus in on overall score now. Let's put everything together here and see what it looks like. The lower the score, the better, because it means you finished higher across the board in all of these categories averaged out. It is no shock whatsoever when you take a look at tier 1 players that Jahmyr Gibbs was at the very top. Jahmyr Gibbs had just a fantastic season last year. And I got to admit, when we talk about him and David Montgomery finishing right back here at number 5, I waited till this video to talk a little bit more about the retirement of Frank Ragnow. That is a huge, huge hit for this offensive line. Some people might realize it and some people might not. If you're an avid football fan, Frank Ragnow, his name is no shock whatsoever to you. You've heard it before. If you're a Detroit Lions fan, you obviously know who he is. But if you're more of a casual player, Frank Ragnow is going to go down as one of the greatest centers of all time. And he's only 29 years old. This is a guy that since he's entered the league has 7 Pro Bowl appearances and consistently is ranked inside the top run blockers and pass blockers at the center position. And losing him in Detroit is going to be a huge issue considering they're also replacing one of their guards already too. The interior of the offensive line for Detroit is going to be an issue this year. Now there are some guys that maybe they step up and they play very well, and that would be awesome. In terms of who's going to be affected the most, David Montgomery. To me, David Montgomery, his value is hurt more at this point because of how he runs in between the tackles. Where with Jahmyr Gibbs, he's a guy that they do a little bit more misdirection with and get him outside the tackles a little bit more often, meaning he's not going to have to worry about running in between those guard positions and having some issues if they're just not blocking as well in the middle of that offensive line as what we are used to. Jahmyr Gibbs for me is a guy that can still have this type of a season. And when we get done going through all the scores, we're also going to look at the changes from volume to efficiency and whether any of these guys or how many of these guys saw a positive increase in where they scored in volume compared to where they scored in efficiency. A guy like Derrick Henry finishing at number 2 is no shock whatsoever. Bucky Irving finishing at number 3 is a good sign for all of you out there that want to draft him as a top 10 running back. Am I taking him in the first round? Probably not. Do I want him as my RB1? I don't know if I'm willing to go that far yet. But if you are a heavy running back draft strategy type of person, going with a top running back in the first round and then Bucky Irving in the second round, to me, would be a great start to your draft. Bucky Irving in the second as your RB2 could be very good. What about James Conner later in your draft? Is Trey Benson going to take over for him this year? Efficiency-wise, James Conner, very, very good. He really didn't finish all that bad in terms of volume either last season, but Trey Benson is waiting. If James Conner plays like this, though, Trey Benson is going to be waiting longer, and James Conner can end up being a steal later on in drafts. James Cook, for the amount of volume he got compared to the touchdowns he had, that was a big issue because volume-wise, he didn't score all that great, even though he had a ton of touchdowns. But in terms of efficiency, he scores very well in efficiency here, which is good. Josh Jacobs, same thing. He is a tier 1 player in terms of efficiency. But what about the tier 2 players? Do not shoot the messenger. I have absolutely nothing to do with Saquon Barkley finishing as a tier 2 player. Nothing at all to do with it. Not my fault. These are all statistics that I pulled offline, put together, and I'm showing and talking to you about them. I'm not hating on Saquon Barkley. He's still probably the number 1 draft pick in most fantasy football formats. But he really got hurt in receiving. That's where he got crushed, and that's why he fell right here. With the receiving yards, in the receiving categories, he finished 22nd and 20th in a couple of them. If he had just finished top 15, he would have been a tier 1 player. Tank Bigsby, Jordan Mason. Tank Bigsby is going to be hard for me to call right now because you've got Bashal Tutton, who is also going to be there along with Travis Etienne and some really good pass catchers as well. That's going to make things tough for Tank Bigsby to have a ton of volume. But if Travis Etienne gets hurt again, I could see Tank Bigsby having a pretty big year as long as he holds on to the football. Okay, that's his biggest thing, fumbles. If he fumbles the football, he is screwed. But when he holds on to the football, he's just fine. So if you're investing in Tank Bigsby, we're going to dive more into that here a little bit later in the offseason. If you're investing in Tank Bigsby, hope he holds on to the football, and unfortunately, you have to hope that Travis Etienne is traded or let go before the season starts. Jordan Mason, I don't have a doubt in my mind that Jordan Mason can beat out Aaron Jones. I don't. I think Jordan Mason is going to end up being the RB1 in Minnesota. before too many weeks are up there. Between Aaron Jones just coming off a career year in terms of volume, having injury issues prior to that while in Green Bay. Jordan Mason, to me, yes, unfortunately lost a lot of last season due to an injury, but he was so good before that injury. With this passing attack in Minnesota, he could be very good there. Joe Mixon, a tier 2 player, even though the back half of his season was very, very bad. Devon Achane, you would like to see a little bit more efficiency, and that's where a lot of that upside will come into play. Volume-wise, you got to wonder if he gets a little bit more volume. From an efficiency standpoint, though, he's got to get a little bit better, and that probably happens with a full season of Tua. If Tua, Tyreek, Jalen Waddle, all those guys can stay healthy. Bijan Robinson, ton of volume, but he saw a pretty dramatic drop. And when we talk about the players that saw the biggest drop from volume to efficiency, his name will come up. We'll talk about him in a minute. And Brian Robinson is a tier 2 player. I mentioned him a couple of minutes ago. Brian Robinson, to me, could be a very, very safe flex play, and if he is, that is very good for your fantasy team later in drafts. All right, let's take a look at tier 3 players. Breece Hall is a guy, hopefully with some improved play at the quarterback position, which is kind of crazy to say, seeing as they had Aaron Rodgers, and now they have Justin Fields, but just some more consistency in that offense and more big plays to really help open some things up. Breece Hall could end up getting back there, but last year was a bad year for efficiency for him. Chase Brown, I'd love to see some more efficiency from Chase Brown. A decent enough volume, but I'd like to see him do a few things better, especially in an offense where you are so concerned about the pass catchers. This right here, a little concerning for me regarding Chase Brown. Am I off of him? I'm not off of him, but I do think maybe the ceiling's a little bit lower than what a lot of people would like it to be. Aaron Jones, it's all about staying healthy. And last year was a lot of volume for him, and with all that volume, he wasn't all that efficient. Jordan Mason was way better in the efficiency categories. Let's hope that Aaron Jones and Jordan Mason can sort themselves out so we're not trying to figure out that backfield a majority of the year. Kenneth Walker, a couple of areas that he finished very well in, some areas that he finished very bad in. That offensive line is going to be key. Chuba Hubbard, Najee Harris, Alvin Kamara, J.K. Dobbins, Jonathan Taylor. When you take a look at all of these guys, you think about offense. You know, Chuba Hubbard, Bryce Young really didn't start playing all that better until later in the season. Chuba Hubbard's had some great volume numbers. Efficiency wasn't that great. Najee Harris, Arthur Smith. Alvin Kamara, injuries at the quarterback position, and basically every wide receiver that they had. J.K. Dobbins, good from a volume standpoint, and coming back from the injuries that he had, I'm not going to shake my head at what he did last season. Jonathan Taylor, poor quarterback play. A lot of these things really add up when it comes to some of these guys that scored a lot lower. All right, let's take a look at the final tier here, and if we think any of these guys can make a move towards higher tiers this season. DeAndre Swift has a much better offense around him. So DeAndre Swift, out of all of these guys here, to me personally, probably has the first or second highest chance to see his tier change going into next season. If he's utilized, his efficiency should get better this year just because the offense around him as a whole will be a whole lot better. The next person would be Kyren Williams. If the wide receivers and Matthew Stafford can stay healthy, my hope is that Kyren Williams would see a little bit of a bump at least in terms of his overall efficiency. These are the two guys that I think could make the biggest jump. Tyrone Tracy, definitely the potential for better quarterback play. And if that happens, Tyrone Tracy has a chance to be way more efficient, but what will the volume look like? If the efficiency is really, really high, then maybe he's a guy that we expect to be a flex play if he loses volume to Cam Skattebo. But if he doesn't lose a ton of volume to Skattebo and he sees his upside go up, then we see a guy that has a better floor and a higher upside. Rico Dowdle, he's in a new situation in Carolina, but he's got Chuba Hubbard in front of him. I doubt Rico Dowdle is going to get a significant amount of volume change unless something were to happen to Chuba Hubbard, and we don't want that to happen. Kareem Hunt likely going to be moving back to like an RB3 role in that offense. Ramondre Stevenson is a guy that Would love to see some more efficiency from him next year. He is a guy that made his name based on efficiency. The breakout a couple of years ago from Ramondre Stevenson, I called based on a lot of the efficiency things that we saw. So his drop in efficiency last year is not good for his outlook moving forward. And TreVeyon Henderson is going to have something to say about that. Talked about Kyren Williams already. Tony Pollard, for me, finishing last here in efficiency is not great, but you got to wonder if it's going to be a whole lot better with Cam Ward as their quarterback this season. If it is, then I'm all on board with Tony Pollard being a really safe floor with some weekly upside. You have to think that the efficiency will get better with a competent quarterback that can throw the football down the field a little bit better than what we saw with Will Levis. And let me not necessarily say better, but more consistently while not turning the ball over. But let's take a look at the biggest risers and fallers from volume scoring to efficiency scoring. The top riser was Tank Bigsby, with Jordan Mason being right behind him. Tank Bigsby scored 20 spots higher. Jordan Mason scored 19 spots higher from where they were in volume to where they were in efficiency. David Montgomery saw a big jump. Brian Robinson saw a big jump. Bucky Irving saw a big jump. Also finishing on a positive note, James Cook, J.K. Dobbins, Derrick Henry, James Conner, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Joe Mixon, and even Jahmyr Gibbs finished one spot higher in efficiency than where he finished in volume. This was a guy that absolutely should be drafted as a top 3 running back, because while he still scores high in efficiency, he is scoring higher in terms of volume as well. Tyrone Tracy had no change whatsoever. Tyrone Tracy was at 0. But let's take a look at the biggest fallers. And we go to the bottom of the list to begin with. Kyren Williams and Bijan Robinson falling this low. Yeah, that's not good. I don't love seeing that. Now, Bijan Robinson, to be fair, did finish just inside that tier 2 list of players here in efficiency, but it was still 13 spots lower than where he finished in terms of volume. When you see a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs finishing at the top of both categories, but you're seeing a big drop for Bijan Robinson in efficiency, Jahmyr Gibbs, to me, is still going over Bijan Robinson at this point. But Bijan Robinson, because of the volume and the ability for the efficiency to potentially get better with Michael Penix as the quarterback all season, Bijan Robinson has a couple of different outcomes. Outcome number 1, if the efficiency doesn't get better, Bijan Robinson is probably a top 5, 6, or 7 running back. If the efficiency gets better and Bijan Robinson finishes top 5 in terms of efficiency next season, and this scoring right here, he's probably the RB1 overall. Kyren Williams, he's just got to be better. We know the volume is going to be there, but he needs to score better in efficiency. The touchdowns are there, giving him a safer floor, but the efficiency is keeping him from having a higher upside. Alvin Kamara, Chuba Hubbard, Tony Pollard, Aaron Jones, Chase Brown, would have loved to see him finish a little bit higher, especially with that passing offense they have there. I hope he gets a little bit better in that area. Jonathan Taylor, Najee Harris, Ramondre Stevenson, DeAndre Swift, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs seeing a little bit of a drop. Not super shocked about that. Their volume is more than enough to carry them, though, so I'm not super scared about it. You got a guy, Rico Dowdle, Kareem Hunt, Devon Achane, all of these guys just barely dropping from volume to efficiency. But Headliner Nation, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you're finding these videos knowledgeable, chock full of information that you're going to be able to use on draft day this season. And we've got a ton more to come as well. We're going to be breaking things down like crazy moving forward. So Headliner Nation, hit that like button for me. If you're new here to the channel, you got to subscribe and stick around all off season long, and make sure you turn on those bell notifications so anytime we go live, y'all are going to know about it right away. And when we drop new content, you can check it out right when it releases. For now, Headliner Nation, I'm going to get out of here. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.